Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. This week marks the 1 year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A year ago, most thought it would be impossible that Ukraine would have most of its country still under its own control. But a year on, the Russians and the Ukrainians are locked into a World War I style trench warfare, mostly in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers have reportedly been either killed or wounded, with the majority of those Russians, based on those reports. For more perspective on the Russian invasion a year on, what it's meant for the region as well as for the world at large, and also perhaps what to expect in the coming months and even years, we're now joined by CU Denver professor Christoph Stevas for a bit more on this. And Professor Stevas specializes in Eastern European studies with a particular focus on Russia. And we're also joined by CU Denver professor Bessie Jose, who specializes in international law and norms. So thanks to both of you for helping us get a bit more insight about this fact.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Professor Stevas, I do want to start with you. A year ago, when we first spoke to you about this, it seemed almost inconceivable that the Ukrainians could repel the Russians for so long. Did it not? And what is your kind of overall reflection now, a year into how the war has gone compared to what you expected then?
Yeah, I think that many analysts were wrong. Like we expected the Ukrainian forces to be overrun within weeks, maybe not even days, and that hasn't happened. Which partially is due to the fact that the Ukrainian forces were much better equipped and trained than we had all expected. It had also to do with very tactical mistakes done by the Russians attacking Ukraine from various sides at the same time, not being able to hold the supply lines which have been attacked by the Ukrainians quite successfully. But then, of course, we also did not expect that I at least did not expect that President Putin would still be in power. Many analysts thought that once his war turns out to be rather unsuccessful, he would be somewhat toppled, right? That maybe there would be street protests or the elites would rise against him because of the economic sanctions and because of the body bags coming back home. But the economic sanctions were not really that strong, or they were strong maybe, but Russia has been able to find new export markets for its natural resources primarily. And the Russians have shown more resolve and not less resolve the more of their children come home dead from the battlefield.
And obviously, I would imagine that'll have big implications for what may happen in the coming months and years. We'll have a bit more on that in just a second. Professor Jose, I do want to ask you a bit more, maybe looking back over the past year and what international law might have to say about the war from a broad perspective. Big question is this, by international standards, an illegal war? And if so, what can be done to enforce that?
Yeah, I think most legal commentators would find that this war is illegal. Russia has made some justifications based in international law for why it invaded Ukraine and is waging war in Ukraine, but those don't really, they're not very convincing. The idea that Ukraine is a threat, the idea that Ukraine is engaging in genocide, these aren't really persuasive to the international community. In addition to waging an illegal war in terms of violating what international law says are the reasons that countries can go to war with each other, there is pretty convincing evidence that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine as well. We see the targeting of civilian structures like apartment buildings, hospitals. I think we all remember the maternity hospital that was struck early on in the war. Those images, I don't think I'll ever forget those. Bucha has been the site of really brutal murders. So war crimes, at least from a personal standpoint, I believe have been committed. There have been various legal mechanisms that have been underway to investigate and prosecute war crimes. So the Ukrainian judicial system itself has been investigating and prosecuting war crimes. The International Criminal Court has also been investigating war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. And I believe the European Parliament very recently passed a resolution to set up a special tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression.
And Professor Jost, kind of want to stick with you on that for a quick second. If that, let's say that the investigating bodies do find sufficient evidence of a crime and they convict, or whatever the equivalent of that would be, what would the potential ramifications be for the Russians?
Well, we wouldn't see Putin leaving Russia anytime soon after those verdicts are rendered. It would be difficult for Putin or any high officials like Lavrov to leave Russia. It would also legitimize additional punitive measures like additional sanctions, things of that nature. So I would imagine those kinds of things happening in the aftermath of guilty verdicts.
So that'll be obviously important to find out over the course of the next few months. Professor Stevens, I do want to go back to you for a quick second about the war at large. And I thought what you said was pretty interesting about Putin only gaining, perhaps in terms of support for the war, despite the fact that it's gone so badly compared to what a lot of analysts thought. How do you think that the Russian, first of all, what level of support do you think there is in Russia? And second of all, how could that continue to sustain the war over the coming months and perhaps years?
Well, Russia is an autocratic regime, so it's very difficult to figure out what the general population thinks. But some of the polls that we have seen is about that around 50 to 60% of the Russians actually support the war at the current, and 40% do not. But many of them fled Russia, especially the younger people and the more educated people. A lot of IT folks left Russia, so the support is not strong, but definitely strong enough. And the elites, I would say, stay strongly behind Putin at this point. This regime is built around Putin. So all of the economic benefits, all kind of career advancement only goes through this man. So to turn against him is very, very risky at this point. It's a classical chicken game. And I don't think that Putin has to fear much at this point. His health might be a little bit different. I don't know if you saw the speech yesterday by him. He looks frail. There's a lot of coughing. So we don't really know how well he is.
And it's worth noting that he is, I believe, 70 years old at this point, so he is obviously getting on there in age a little bit. Professor Stevens, I guess another question when it comes to that. What are your thoughts on how the U.S. and the West have responded to the war, considering the fact that at the beginning there was a bit of a question as to how much support there would be for it? It seems for the moment, especially maybe rallying around Poland a little bit, that the support for the war has mostly held together. Do you anticipate that staying over the coming months and perhaps years?
It's a little bit of a half, the glass half full or half empty, right? Half full, you could say, amazing how the West has rallied behind Ukraine, for sure. Half empty, but very slowly. So some of the weapon systems that have been delivered, these long-range HIMARS that with precise targeting came to my way too late. Now these advanced battle tanks from Germany and the United States, Leopard 2 and the Abrams delivered, but also too late, in my opinion. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And the future, as far as this Western support is concerned, really very much depends on domestic forces. So we hear some in the Republican Party, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, who is opposing this war, is opposing the Ukrainians, or not the Ukrainians, but it's opposing that the United States continues supporting Ukraine. In Germany, for instance, where I am currently, the far left and the far right, the left, the former communists, as well as the far right populist AfD, are against supporting Ukraine, and they talk about making peace. And it's absolutely unclear how this can be achieved. Peace for them probably means that Russia just takes Ukraine. So it depends a little bit on the political developments in the next couple of years, I would think, because that's at least as long as I anticipate this war to last. But I'm actually optimistic that the Western support will not fall apart.
Well, I guess, Professor Josa, kind of back to you as we kind of maybe look forward a little bit more. What do you anticipate coming in the coming months, again, perhaps years here, depending on how long this goes? How do you see this war potentially ending?
Yeah, I'm from a civilian standpoint, I'm pretty pessimistic. As the war drags on, the more civilians that are killed and injured, and the more civilian infrastructure is damaged. I think Putin has to make a point about winning the war. Part of the reason for waging this war in Ukraine is to reinforce this notion that Russia is a great nation, and great nations win wars, they don't lose wars. So that means that the Russians are probably going to be a little bit more brutal as the war drags on. And so I imagine much more civilian suffering. And that includes things like the environment. The environment has been heavily damaged by the war in Ukraine, and it's going to take decades for the environment to recuperate and for Ukrainians to be able to have some semblance of the life they had before the war started. So I am very pessimistic about what the situation is going to look like for civilians on the ground in Ukraine.
Very interesting, considering especially the environment is an aspect I don't think has been talked about perhaps enough. To your point there, Professor Jost. Professor Stevens, again, maybe with the back knowledge here at this point for our audience, that again, it seems like both sides are fairly entrenched, again, literally entrenched warfare, World War I style at times, in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. How do you see this war ending, and what would it take for some sort of a peace resolution to potentially take place here in the coming months?
I think a lot of it depends, and we haven't talked about yet, but China has, let the world know that it is willing to support Russia with weapons. That's a very scary development, because it could easily escalate further into literally a world war. Not that everyone is at war with each other, but that all major forces in the world are somehow in the Ukrainian battlefield involved. That is pretty bad news. Ideally, of course, the West would support the Ukrainians to a degree that they can divide the eastern flank into northeastern and southeastern flanks, that they can actually have a breakthrough and then isolate essentially the Russian troops into two parts. If that is going to happen, that really depends on further support. It's difficult to say. As you know, from the start, I've been wondering how we can get Putin to the negotiation table. And I think the only way to do that is essentially by strength. There's a lot of talk, like we need to talk to him. Yes, sure, we need to talk to him. We have to use all diplomatic means possible, and we do. The problem is he does not want to. I think my colleague Betsy Jones has been completely right on this. Great powers do not lose. Putin cannot lose this war. He has to come out of it with at least something, be it the Donbas and Crimea, maybe at a minimum, but that is, I think, the absolute minimum. And the Ukrainians would have to say, yes, we are okay with that. I think they were willing to do this back in March of last year. Then Bucha happened, and they realized who they are dealing with, really. So the West needs to continue to support Ukraine so that the Russians see that they don't have a chance to get more than the Donbas and the Crimea, and then maybe peace negotiations start. But other major powers have to get involved. If China finally said, okay, we don't want this anymore, it is hurting the world economy, that means it's hurting China. Then, and China puts some pressure on the Kremlin, on Putin, then maybe we get negotiations a little bit faster. But when I hear other people like President Lula of Brazil saying, oh yeah, he's going to negotiate a peace deal, I have to say that's a bit ridiculous, because President Putin is not listening to President Lula of Brazil. That's just not a very important country to Russia.
It's stunning, South America, China, all these different countries getting involved in what seems to be an increasingly global conflict. I guess, Professor Joseph, I do want to go back to you one more time here for your thoughts about what Professor Stevens just said about China's potential involvement and the perhaps globalization of this conflict as well.
Yeah, I mean, the possibility of China providing weapons to Russia is alarming. We should all be concerned about that. Not only because it makes the war, it broadens the war so that now China is a party to the conflict or potential party to the conflict. But again, from a civilian perspective, if China is getting involved by providing weapons, that means it's going to be deadlier for civilians on the ground. I'm also concerned and a bit troubled or disappointed by India's position with the Ukrainian conflict. India has been buying weapons from Russia, buying energy from Russia, and that has helped finance the conflict. It has supported or defended Russia in the United Nations. And in some ways, this makes sense because historically, Russia or the Soviet Union and India have had long ties with each other. But as a former colony itself, India has the potential to be a moral voice in terms of defending the norms around sovereignty. And the fact that it hasn't is really a lost opportunity.
Well, lots of fascinating insight from both of you, Professor Jose and Professor Stevens. But I think we could continue to chat about this, I would imagine, for hours. But I think we'll have to leave it there. But I certainly appreciate both of your insight here today and lending us your expertise about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the 1-year anniversary of it. So thank you both so much for lending us your expertise here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.